The city of Chicago thrummed with life as twilight surrendered to the embrace of night. The streets, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the flickering neon of shop signs, buzzed with the restless energy of urban existence. Engines growled, horns blared in sporadic bursts, and the wet pavement shimmered with reflections of a world that never truly slept. Laughter spilled from restaurant doorways, blending with the distant wail of sirens, while pedestrians darted between parked cars, their shadows stretching long and thin under the autumn sky. It was a typical evening in the windy city, alive with motion and possibility. Yet beneath its surface simmered tensions old and Newtonsians that, on this night, would erupt into a confrontation no one could have foreseen. Inside a modest diner on the edge of downtown, Officer Glenn Harper sat hunched over a chipped countertop, nursing the dregs of a lukewarm coffee. The faint clink of his spoon against the mug punctuated the low hum of chatter around him. A broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, Harper carried the weight of 2 decades on the police force in the lines etched deep into his weathered face. Once, he'd been a rookie with stars in his eyes, driven by a naive belief in justice and order. But years of grinding shifts, broken promises, and a city that seemed to chew up ideals had hardened him. His fingers drummed restlessly against the counter as his hazel eyes skimmed the headlines. Of the Chicago Tribune, another shooting, another protest, another day in a world he'd grown to distrust. That distrust had festered into something uglier, a habit of sizing people up, based on snap judgments, a cynicism that painted entire neighborhoods as threats, and a willingness to wield his badge like a scepter. With a heavy sigh, he tossed the paper aside, the pages fluttering like a wounded bird, and gulped down the last of his drink. He slid a crumpled dollar bill across the counter, a meager tip for the waitress, who'd barely glanced his way before shrugging on his jacket and stepping into the crisp night air. Outside, the towering silhouettes of skyscrapers vanished beneath a blanket of clouds rolling in from Lake Michigan. The chill bit at Harper's neck as he zipped up his coat, a faint shiver running through him. He climbed into his squat car, the familiar creak of the seat welcoming him like an old friend. The engine roared to life, and with it came a restless itch and urge to patrol, to assert control, to find something or someone out of place. It wasn't about crime tonight, not really. It was about power, about reminding the streets who held the reins. He flicked on his patrol lights, their red and blue pulses cutting through the darkness, and began to cruise, his eyes sharp and predatory. Across town, Camila Robinson steered her aging Toyota Camry through the labyrinth of Chicago's North Side. At 29, she was a woman on the cusp of history, her heart still racing with the thrill of her recent appointment as an interim judge. Just 2 days ago, she'd received the news that would etch her name into the annals of Cook County. She'd be one of the youngest judges ever to serve, and the first black woman to preside over the newly formed Community Integrity Court. The weight of that responsibility mingled with a fierce pride in her chest, though exhaustion tugged at her edges after a long evening with a local civil rights group. They'd spent hours poring over strategies to keep young offenders from slipping back into the system of D's that lit a fire in her soul. Now, as she navigated the familiar streets toward her apartment, the mellow notes of jazz floated from her radio, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in time with the rhythm. The Camry, a relic from her law school days, purred beneath her careful hands, a testament to her diligence in all things. She wore a quiet smile, her mind buzzing with the promise of what lay ahead, blissfully unaware that the night held a reckoning for her too. The clock on Camilla's dashboard glowed 10:18 p.m. as she turned onto a quieter stretch of road, the scenery shifting to rows of weathered brick buildings. Their shuttered windows and faded signs whispered of a bygone era, though the pulse of nightlife kept the area alive. This was a place of contrast, bars and clubs spilling light onto the sidewalks, yet shadowed by a reputation for heavy-handed policing, especially toward black drivers. Camilla's eyes flicked to her rearview mirror, catching the glint of a squad car trailing behind her. She wasn't speeding. Her taillights worked fine. Her registration was up to date. Yet a familiar unease crept up her spine, a prickle she couldn't shake. She'd felt it before too many times, though tonight it seemed sharper, heavier, as if the air itself held its breath. Then, without warning, The squad car's lights flared to life, red and blue swirling like a storm in her mirror. The siren's shriek pierced the stillness, and her stomach plummeted. There was no reason for this. She was just a woman driving home, a judge-to-be with a spotless record. But reason, she knew, didn't always matter in moments like these. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she signaled and eased the car to the curb, the gravel crunching under her tires. She took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself as she ran through the mental checklist she'd memorized long ago. Keys out, hands visible, stay calm. Her fingers trembled faintly as she reached into the glove compartment for her license, insurance, and registration, the papers rustling in her grip. She was a lawyer, soon a judge, yet here she was, reduced to the same raw fear that gnawed at countless others in her community. It infuriated her, this vulnerability, but she swallowed it down, forcing a mask of composure. Officer Harper approached, his boots thudding against the pavement with a deliberate rhythm. His silhouette loomed in her window, broad and imposing, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his cap. Up close, his eyes were cold, his jaw clenched tight as if holding back a storm of his own. Camila rolled down her window, the cool night air rushing in, and offered a greeting laced with practiced calm. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Harper's gaze raked over her, lingering on her face. Her hands, the modest interior of her car. "License and registration," he snapped, his tone clipped and commanding. She nodded, handing over the documents with a quiet, "Of course, here you go." He snatched them without a word and retreated to his patrol car, leaving her to stew in the silence. The minutes stretched on, each second a weight pressing against her chest. The dashboard clock ticked to 10:25 before Harper returned, his expression darker, his posture rigid. "You in a hurry, ma'am?" he asked, though the question felt like an accusation. His voice dripping with suspicion. "Not particularly," Camila replied, meeting his stare with a quiet defiance. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer, his silence thick and oppressive. He studied her, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to push back. "You made a wide turn back there," he said at last, the words flat and unconvincing. A flimsy excuse she could see through in an instant. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Her pulse quickened, a flutter of alarm racing through her. She knew the law knew he hadn't given her a lawful basis for this demand. But she also knew the stakes, a deserted street, a lone officer with a hand hovering near his holster, and her, a black woman in a city where such encounters could turn deadly. "Officer, am I being detained?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with steel. His body stiffened, his hand twitching slightly. "Step out." Now, the command was sharp, unyielding, and Camilla's mind raced. She glanced around empty sidewalks, dim streetlights, the nearest person a block away, disappearing into a corner store. Her options were grim: comply and risk escalation, or resist and invite worse. With a heavy breath, she opened the door and stepped into the night, the cold biting at her skin. Harper towered over her, his presence suffocating. "What's your name?" he demanded, glancing at the license still clutched in his hand. "Camila Robinson," she answered, her voice firm despite the storm brewing inside her. "What are you doing out here this late?" She inhaled deeply, fighting to keep her composure. "I'm returning from a meeting." Before she could elaborate, he cut her off, spinning her round with a rough grip and pressing her against the hood of her car. "Spread your arms," he barked, his tone laced with aggression. The metal was cold against her palms, the indignity of it searing her cheeks. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice rising with a mix of anger and humiliation. "I haven't done anything wrong." Harper ignored her, his hands moving briskly over her in a pat-down that felt more like a violation than a search. Her breath hitched, her mind reeling with outrage. She could tell him she was a lawyer, that she was days away from donning judicial robes, but the thought withered as quickly as it came. To him, she was just another target, and her credentials might only fuel his resentment. When he found nothing, no drugs, no weapons, no excuse for his hostility, spun her back around, his face a mask of frustration. The air between them crackled with unspoken truths, his abuse of power, her quiet resilience. and the reckoning that waited just beyond the horizon. Days later, the scene shifted to a courtroom bathed in the soft glow of morning light. Harper stood before the bench, his uniform crisp, but his confidence fraying at the edges. He'd been called to answer for a string of complaints: excessive force, racial profiling, a pattern of conduct that had finally caught up with him. The room hummed with murmurs as the bailiff announced the judge's entrance, and the door swung open. Camila stepped in, her judicial robes flowing like a mantle of authority, her presence commanding and serene. Harper's jaw slackened, his eyes widening in disbelief as recognition dawned. The woman he'd humiliated on that rain-slicked street now held his fate in her hands. The onlookers, clerks, spectators fell silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Camilla's gaze met Harper's, steady and unflinching, a quiet storm brewing behind her calm exterior. She hadn't sought this confrontation, but fate had delivered it with poetic precision. What followed was a clash of justice and prejudice, a reckoning for a man who'd wielded power without restraint. Harper's career teetered on the edge as Camila presided with the impartiality she'd sworn to uphold, her every word a reminder of the consequences that follow when authority is abused. In that courtroom, karma unfurled its wings, and the lesson was clear: no one stands above the law, and those who trample on justice will one day face its unwavering gaze. The night was thick with tension as Officer Glenn Harper stood before Camila, his eyes glinting under the dim streetlight, probing her face for any flicker of weakness or surrender. He tilted his head slightly, his posture rigid with authority, as if he could bend her will with the weight of his stare alone. Camila, though, refused to shrink. She squared her shoulders, her chin lifting defiantly as she met his gaze with a steady intensity that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Got anything in the car I need to know about?" he asked, his voice dripping with a heavy, suggestive edge, like he was daring her to lie. "No," she replied, her tone sharp and unwavering, cutting through the humid air between them. Harper smirked, a slow, deliberate curl of his lip, and gestured toward the passenger side of her vehicle with a lazy flick of his hand. "Mind if I take a look?" His words were less a question and more a taunt, testing her resolve. Camilla's heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her voice measured, her legal training kicking in like a reflex. "Do you have probable cause? Because unless I'm under arrest, you don't have the right." She watched his expression harden, his sneer deepening as he took her careful push back as a personal affront. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the asphalt, his presence looming. "Look, lady," he said, his tone turning cold and menacing, "we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. I'll write you up for reckless driving, maybe toss and resisting an officer, or interfering with an investigation. How's that sound?" Her stomach twisted as the threat sank in. Camila knew the game he was playing, knew that refusing could mean hours of harassment, a night in a holding cell, or worse. She cast a quick glance around the deserted street, her eyes darting to the faint silhouettes of buildings in the distance. A tiny spark of hope flared when she spotted the soft glow of a security camera, perched above the convenience store a block away, its lens too far to catch the details of this standoff but close enough to remind her she wasn't entirely invisible. Still, it offered no immediate rescue. She exhaled a shaky breath, her resolve wavering under the pressure. "Fine," she muttered, barely audible. "Go ahead." Harper didn't hesitate. He pulled a flashlight from his belt, its beam slicing through the darkness as he yanked open her car door, and began rummaging through her belongings with a rough, careless energy. Camila stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her anger simmering like a pot about to boil over. She listened to the muffled thuds of the glove compartment snapping open, the rustle of papers being shoved aside, the creak of the back seat as he pawed through a towel of it, a violation masked as procedure. Her jaw clenched as she imagined what he was hoping to find. Some flimsy excuse to escalate this encounter, to prove his suspicions, to justify the power he wielded so recklessly. Minutes dragged on, and when Harper finally emerged, empty-handed, a smug grin stretched across his face. He sauntered back toward her, his flashlight dangling at his side. "You like giving cops a hard time, huh?" he said, stepping into her space again, close enough that she could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. Camila drew in a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her fear down deep where he couldn't see it. "I'm simply exercising my rights, officer," she replied. Her voice steady despite the tremor she felt creeping into her hands. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing with a mix of irritation and disdain, as if her composure offended him. Then, with a curt nod, he thrust her license and registration back into her hands, the papers crinkling against her fingers. "Go on, get out of here," he said, his lip curling into a sneer as he turned away. "And watch your driving." Camila clutched the documents, her hand shaking slightly as she shoved them into her purse. She climbed back into her car, slamming the door with a force that echoed down the quiet street. A small release for the fury coiled inside her. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her temples throbbing as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she pulled away, careful not to glance back in the rearview mirror though. She could feel Harper's eyes boring into her, tracking her every move. What Harper didn't know, couldn't possibly suspect, was that the woman he'd just humiliated under the guise of authority would soon hold a power far greater than his badge. In less than a week, Camila would stand in a courtroom, her robes draped over her shoulders, a gavel in her hand, poised to dispense justice, perhaps even over him. As she drove through the empty streets, her breaths came in slow, deliberate pulls, each one an attempt to steady the chaos swirling in her mind. At a red light, she stopped, and a wave of nausea crashed over her. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. As she replayed the encounter, arrogance in his voice, the invasive sweep of his flashlight, the way he'd trampled her rights with such casual confidence, it could have ended so much worse. She realized, and the thought sent a chill racing down her spine. Reaching into the cuffholder, she grabbed her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Should she call the precinct now, lodge a complaint while the details were fresh? She imagined the dispatcher's bored tone, the inevitable brush-off, the way the system so often shielded its own. Her mind spun with options. Tell her mentor, Judge Sarita Hill, whose wisdom had guided her through law school. Reach out to the civil rights advocates she'd met with just days ago, who'd urge her to make a stand. But exhaustion weighed heavy on her, a bone-deep weariness that drowned out the fire of indignation. All she wanted was the sanctuary of her apartment, the quiet of her own space. When she finally pulled into her parking garage, her hand trembled as she cut the engine. She sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in, then leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, her breaths ragged. "You're safe now," she whispered to herself, a fragile reassurance. "It's over." But a darker voice inside her countered, low and insistent, "Not for long." Men like Harper didn't stop. His sneer lingered in her memory, a vivid imprint of prejudice and unchecked power. He'd detained her on nothing, searched her car without cause, tried to cow her into submission, and the law, clear as day, called it an abuse. Yet he'd acted with the brazen certainty of someone who'd done it before, someone who'd never faced consequences. How many others had he cornered? How many had buckled under his threats, unaware they could fight back? She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her footsteps heavy, and flicked on a single lamp. The soft glow spilled across the living room, but the familiar space felt alien tonight, shadowed by the violations she'd endured. She shed her clothes mechanically, stepped into the shower, and let the scalding water pour over her, steam rising in thick curls. Eyes closed, she pictured the days ahead, her judicial appointment ceremony at the Cook County Courthouse, the weight of the robe settling on her shoulders. The first cases she'd hear, traffic violations, petty disputes, the trauma of tonight stung. A fresh wound that made her dread the bench, but beneath that fear, a spark of determination flickered. She had power now, a chance to right wrongs, to hold men like Harper accountable. Across town, Harper slumped in his dimly lit living room, a lukewarm beer sweating in his grip. The TV blared a sports game, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the stop. Something about that woman gnawed at him, her steady voice, the way she'd challenged him without flinching, the quiet dignity in her eyes. It wasn't fear he'd seen, but defiance, and it rattled him more than he'd admit. He took a swig of his beer, muttering to himself, "Probably some fancy college kid. Thinks she's better than me 'cause she knows her rights." He'd convinced himself the stop was just to feed another suspicious face in a neighborhood. He'd long deemed trouble. It was a story he'd told himself for years, fed by the nods of a few cynical colleagues, drowning out the quieter voices on the force who'd tried to call him out. He tossed the empty can into the trash, stumbled to bed, and collapsed, restless sleep tugging at him. Neither of them rested easy that night. Camila was haunted by the sting of injustice, the violation of her autonomy. Harper wrestled with an unease he couldn't name, a prickling irritation at her resistance. Morning light crept through Camilla's curtains, stirring her awake earlier than usual. She rose with a quiet resolve, determined to shake off the weight of the night. Over coffee, she decided to confide in Detective Helena Rosales, a friend forged in the fires of law school struggles and shared dreams. Helena worked internal affairs at the Chicago PD, a woman of color like Camila, toughened by years navigating the system's murky waters. Yet warm with a loyalty Camila trusted implicitly. They met at a small cafe near City Hall, the hum of morning traffic filtering through the windows. Helena slid into the chair across from her, her plain clothes rumpled from an overnight shift, her eyes sharp with concern. "Cam, you okay?" she asked, leaning forward. Camila cradled her coffee, the warmth steadying her. "I got pulled over last night, Helena. Officer Glenn Harper, no grounds, just aggression, pure power trip." Helena's jaw tightened, recognition flashing in her gaze. "Harper. I've heard whisper scumplets that never stick. There were investigations a while back, but they fizzled out, evidence too thin." Camila sighed, frustration bubbling up. "That's the problem. They slip through because no one can pin them down. I'm thinking about filing a complaint, but with the appointment next week, the spotlight, you don't know if it's the right move." Helena's lips quirked into a wry smile. "Or you don't want to make yourself a target." Stepping into a judge's robe, Camila nodded, reluctant. "That too. But it's more than thought he feel this duty. If he did it to me, an attorney, imagine what he does to people who can't fight back." Helena reached across the table, her hand firm over Camilla's. "File it. I'll keep tabs on him. Dig where I can. But I get it if you want to wait till after the ceremony, start clean, not tangled in this mess." Camila stared into her coffee, the steam curling upward. "Let me think it over. I'll keep you posted. For now, I just need to breathe." The encounter with Harper had laid bare a truth she couldn't ignore. Justice wasn't automatic, it was a battle. And as she prepared to wield the gavel, she knew the lesson of that night would shape her rulings. Power, unchecked, bred consequence, and she'd be damned if she let it go unanswered. The sun hung low over the Cook County Courthouse. As Camila Robinson stood on the cusp of a life-altering moment, her fingers brushing the crisp fabric of her newly ordered judicial robe. It was a garment meticulously selected to fit her petite frame, a symbol of the authority she was about to wield. Helena, her steadfast confidant, had given her a knowing nod earlier that day. Her voice warm but firm. "I get it," Helena had said, her eyes gleaming with quiet reassurance. "And you know I'm just a call away if you need someone to have your back." Camilla's lips curved into a soft smile then, her chest swelling with gratitude for the unwavering pillar Helena had always been. It was a fleeting moment of comfort amid the whirlwind of her new reality. In the days leading up to her swearing-in, Camila threw herself into the preparations with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She sat across from court administrators in dimly lit offices, their voices a steady hum as they outlined procedures and protocols. She pored over case files, her brow furrowing as she reviewed the upcoming docatraffic violations and petty misdemeanors that would mark her debut on the bench. A bitter chuckle escaped her lips as she traced the words on the page. A fitting start, she mused, the irony not lost on her. Not long ago, she'd been on the other side of the law's heavy hand, pulled over unjustly by a man who saw her as little more than a target. Now, she'd be the one passing judgment. Meanwhile, Officer Glenn Harper cruised the streets in his patrol car, the hum of the engine a familiar companion. He was a man unburdened by the weight of his actions, his conscience as clear as the polished badge pinned to his chest. To him, Camila Robinson was just another name in a sea of faces he'd stopped, questioned, and dismissed. He'd encountered countless people like her drivers who fit a certain profile, who dared to question his authority with a raised eyebrow or a sharp word. In his mind, those moments of defiance were all the justification he needed. Suspicion was his creed, and he wore it like armor, convinced it was his sacred duty to purge the streets of anyone who didn't conform to his narrow vision of order. The day of the swearing-in arrived, and the small courtroom buzzed with an electric energy. Friends, family, and community leaders filled the wooden benches, their chatter weaving a tapestry of excitement and pride. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. Camilla's parents sat in the front row, her mother's delicate hands clutching a tissue as tears glistened in her eyes. Her father's chest puffed out, his grin barely contained beneath a mask of stoic dignity. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and anticipation, tinged with the warmth of a historic moment unfolding. Judge Sarita Hill, a towering figure with a voice that commanded reverence, stepped forward to officiate. Today, she declared, her words resonating through the room, we welcome a brilliant and empathetic soul to the bench. Camilla Robinson has spent her career championing justice and equity, and we are confident she will carry those principles forward in this court. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of applause breaking the stillness. Camilla stood tall, her heart thudding against her ribcage as she repeated the oath. Her voice rang out, steady and clear, each syllable a vow etched into her soul. When the robe settled over her shoulders, it felt heavier than she'd imagined, not just fabric, but a mantle of duty, a reminder of the power she now held and the lives she'd shaped. Afterward, the room erupted into a flurry of celebration. Colleagues from her old law firm clapped her on the back, their laughter mingling with the congratulations of professors who'd once guided her through late-night study sessions. Community activists, whose tireless advocacy had helped pave her path, enveloped her in hugs, their voices thick with pride. Through the throng, Camilla caught Helena's eye. Her friend flashed a wide, radiant smile and a discreet thumbs up. A silent anchor in the storm of emotion, Camilla mouthed a silent thank you, her gratitude swelling alongside a flicker of unease. This was more than a milestone, it was the dawn of a journey that promised both triumph and trials, and she felt the weight of it pressing against her resolve. A week later, Camilla sat alone in her judge's chambers, the faint ticking of a clock punctuating the silence. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the day's docket. Minor infractions and preliminary hearings stretched across the page cases. That might seem trivial to some, but to the people standing before her, they were everything. She exhaled slowly, steeling herself. Every file deserved her full attention, every story a fair hearing. The courtroom soon came alive as defendants shuffled in one by one, traffic offenders with slumped shoulders, a young woman accused of petty theft, a man fidgeting nervously over a minor drug charge. Camilla listened with fierce intensity, her pen poised over her notes, determined to sift through the facts with both compassion and clarity. Then, late in the afternoon, the bailiff's voice cut through the hum of the room. State of Illinois versus Officer Glenn Harper. Time seemed to fracture. Camilla's breath hitched, her pulse roaring in her ears as if the entire courtroom could hear it. Her eyes darted to the file, her fingers tightening around the edges. A preliminary hearing for alleged police misconduct and accusation of excessive force during an arrest escalated to a criminal charge, and there it was, in stark black ink, Glenn Harper, the same officer who'd stopped her on that lonely road, his flashlight blinding, his tone dripping with disdain. She stared at the page, her composure fraying as memories clawed their way to the surface-eth shame, the fear, the rage she'd buried deep. The prosecutor, Adrian Lowe, approached the bench, his weary frame exuding a quiet confidence. "Your Honor," he began, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "This is a preliminary hearing for Officer Glenn Harper, accused of aggravated battery and misconduct while on duty. The victim alleges unnecessary force during a routine traffic stop, resulting in significant injuries." Camilla's gaze shifted to the defense table. There sat Harper, no longer in his crisp uniform, but a stiff suit, his posture rigid, his face a mask of defiance tinged with unease. He hadn't yet looked up, hadn't yet seen who held the gavel. The room seemed to shrink as the past crashed into the present. Camilla felt it all, cold bite of that night's air, the tremble in her hands as she'd gripped the steering wheel, the sting of helplessness as Harper loomed over her. But now, she wasn't that frightened woman anymore. She was the judge, the arbiter of truth. Her authority symbolized by the polished wood beneath her fingers. Yet doubt not at her. If she acknowledged Harper as the man who'd wronged her, ethics might demand she step aside. A conflict of interest could taint the case, undermine the court's integrity. But another voice whispered in her mind, a quieter, fiercer one. What if he'd done this before? What if he'd do it again? Could she let him walk away unexamined? Her thoughts spun as the bailiff called Harper to stand. He rose, his movements deliberate, and only then did his eyes meet hers. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, his brow creasing as if a distant memory tugged at him. Did he recognize her? Camilla's throat tightened, but she steadied herself. "Officer Harper," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You stand before this court for a preliminary hearing on charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct. This proceeding will determine if there's enough evidence to move to trial. Do you have counsel present?" Richard Cohen, Harper's attorney, stood with a practiced ease. "Yes, Your Honor. I represent Officer Harper. We'll enter a plea of not guilty and request an immediate evidence review. We contend the officer acted within his duties." Camilla nodded, her expression unreadable. "Very well, the prosecution may proceed." Adrien Lowe stepped forward, his voice measured as he laid out the case. The victim, Malcolm Harris, was a retired schoolteacher, an older black man with no criminal history, driving home with a trunk full of groceries when Harper pulled him over for a broken taillight. What should have been a routine stop spiraled into violence, a fractured arm, allegations of racial slurs, a bystander's shaky phone video capturing the chaos. Camilla's heart thudded harder with every detail, the parallels to her own encounter chilling her to the bone. She glanced at Harper. His face remained stony, but a shadow of worry flickered in his eyes. Cohen countered smoothly, painting Harper as a dutiful officer reacting to resistance, his force reasonable under the circumstances. It was a slick argument, but Camilla sensed the fragility beneath it. She sat back, her mind racing. She knew Harper's tendencies firsthand, but that knowledge was a double-edged sword. As a judge, she was bound by impartiality, yet as a woman who'd felt his power misused, she burned to see justice done. The lesson loomed largeppo or unchecked bred consequence as she held the scales now. "We'll reconvene tomorrow to hear witness testimony and review video evidence," she announced, striking the gavel. "Court is adjourned." Harper's gaze lingered on her, searching, as the bailiff let him out. Camilla rose, retreating to her chambers with measured steps, her heart still hammering. Alone, she sank into her chair, the robe heavy on her shoulders. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning, and she'd face it head-on, whatever the cost. The room seemed to spin around Camilla as she sat at her desk, her mind a chaotic whirl of thoughts and emotions. She understood the proper course of action might be to step aside, to admit she'd crossed paths with the defendant before an encounter that left an indelible mark on her memory. Yet, she also knew that if she withdrew, the case could fall into the hands of a judge less inclined to dig beneath the surface, someone who might accept the defense's polished story of reasonable force without a second thought. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the phone, dialing her colleague Helena with a voice she forced into a semblance of calm. "Hey," she started, swallowing the unease clawing at her throat. "We need to talk. Can you come by in half an hour?" When Helen arrived, stepping into the office with her usual brisk efficiency, she shut the door behind her, sealing them in a bubble of quiet amid the courthouse's hum. Camilla didn't waste time. She poured out the whole tangled mess. Officer Glenn Harper had just appeared before her bench, accused of misconduct that sent shivers of recognition down her spine, echoing a moment from her own past she'd tried to bury. Helena listened, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing as the story unfolded. "Wow," she murmured at last, her voice soft but weighted with understanding. "That's a mess. You know the ethical rules. If you were a direct victim, recusal might be mandatory. But that traffic stop you mentioned, it was never officially reported, right? No paperwork, no formal complaint." Camilla nodded, her gaze dropping to the case file splayed across her desk like a map of her dilemma. "Exactly, but it still hit me personally. Doesn't that mean there's a conflict? Her voice wavered, betraying the storm brewing inside her, a mix of duty, fear, and a flicker of rage she didn't want to name. Helena shrugged, her practicality cutting through the haze. Legally, maybe not. Practically, though, think about justice. Some judges stay on cases like this if the link is indirect. You weren't part of any investigation, never named as a witness. Officially, you're unconnected. But unofficially, she trailed off, letting the implication hang. Camila rubbed her temples, the pressure building behind her eyes. It feels dishonest to pretend it didn't happen, but I can't stomach the idea of him walking away again, free to hurt someone else. Helena stepped closer, resting a steady hand on Camilla's shoulder, her touch a quiet anchor. You're the judge here. You can make sure it's fair, make sure the victim's voice cuts through the noise, that the evidence isn't swept under the rug. But you've got to stay true to impartial justice. No room for personal revenge, no matter how much he deserves it. Camila let out a slow breath, nodding as the words sank in. You're right. I'll move forward, but carefully. If I sense my history, with Harper creeping into my decisions, I'll step back and let someone else take it. Helena gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, her voice firm. I'll keep an eye on things from my side. Call me if you need anything. After Helena left, Camila sat alone, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. She flipped through the case file again, her eyes tracing the victim's testimony, the grainy bystander video, the stack of supporting statements. If it all held up, it could be enough to push the case forward. But this was just the first step. A hearing was a far cry from a trial, which could stretch on for weeks or months, bogged down by defense tactics designed to exhaust witnesses and dim public outrage. Resolve hardened in her chest. I won't let him slip away, she thought fiercely. But I won't break my oath either. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with a tense, electric stillness as the hearing resumed. The prosecution played their card, a shaky cell phone video shot by a stranger on the street. The footage was rough, the camera jerking with every step, but it captured Harper in stark clarity, slamming the victim, Malcolm Harris, against the hood of his patrol car, wrenching his arm back with a force that made Camilla's stomach twist. Malcolm's cries of pain pierced through the static, raw and haunting. Harper's face flickered with unease, a crack in his stony mask, though he quickly regained composure. His attorney leapt up, voice sharp, arguing the video lacked context. Malcolm had resisted, they claimed, and no slurs were audible to prove malice. Then Malcolm took the stand, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the witness box. His voice quivered as he recounted the night, a routine drive home from the grocery store, the sudden flash of Harper's lights in his rearview mirror, the officer's tone turning hostile when Malcolm dared to ask why he'd been stopped. He twisted my arm so hard I thought it'd snap, Malcolm said, his voice breaking as tears welled in his eyes. I was scared he wouldn't stop. Camila kept her face a mask of neutrality, but inside, anger simmered. How many times has Harper done this, she wondered. How many lives has he shattered, hiding behind his badge? The defense countered with Harper himself, striding to the stand with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He spun a tale of Malcolm reaching for something in the Carmaba weapon, he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed, like a script he'd recited a dozen times before. Camila watched him, her eyes narrowing. His words felt empty, a hollow performance that didn't match the video's brutal truth. When the testimony ended, she retreated to her chambers, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. This wasn't about proving Harper's guilt beyond all doubt, not yet. It was about finding enough evidence to let a jury decide. She paced the room, her breath steadying as she wrestled with her conscience. The evidence, not my feelings, she repeated silently. The video, Malcolm's words, the witness says it was enough. Back on the bench, she faced the courtroom, her voice clear and unwavering. It is the finding of this court that sufficient evidence exists to proceed with charges of aggravated battery and official misconduct against Officer Glenn Harper. The case will advance to trial. Harper's lips tightened, a flash of fury in his eyes, and then recognition. He knew her now, the pieces snapping together in his mind. She struck the gavel lightly, ending the session, and waved off his attorney's request for a sidebar. In the hallway, adrenaline surged through her veins. She'd followed the law, let the evidence lead her, and refused to buckle under fear. But this was only the start. The next morning, a clerk's knock jolted her from her thoughts. The trial court assignment had been fast-tracked, a rare twist due to a shifting caseload. And through the system's random draw, it stayed under her watch. She'd preside over Harper's full trial, a grueling marathon of testimony and cross-examination. With Harper's piercing gaze fixed on her every move, her phone buzzed with a text from Helena. "He knows who you are. Be careful." Camilla's pulse quickened. Stepping away now might raise eyebrows, especially as the media sniffed around. The Chicago Tribune already drafting a piece on police misconduct. Staying meant risking accusations of bias if Harper's team dug into her past. She sought out Judge Sarita Hill, her mentor, a woman whose calm wisdom had guided her through countless storms. In Sarita's office, Camilla laid bare her fierce personal history, the ethical tightrope, the stakes of justice. Sarita listened, tapping a pen against her desk, her lined face thoughtful. "This is tricky, Camilla," she said at last. "Recusals warranted if a conflict clouds your fairness. You've got history with him, but no official record ties you to his actions. The question is, can you judge him impartially, or will that past tip the scales?" Camilla pressed her fingers to her temples. "I felt his cruelty myself. Doesn't that matter?" Sarita nodded gravely. "It does, but if you can weigh the evidence without letting it sway you, you might stay. If you can't, stepping aside is the honorable choice." Camilla left the meeting with no clear answer. Only the lesson etched deeper. Justice demanded balance, and abusing power, whether Harper's or her own, carried consequences that rippled far beyond the courtroom. She'd have to decide soon, knowing every step forward tested her resolve, her integrity, and the fragile line between right and retribution. Camilla drew in a long, steadying breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like an invisible shroud. Her chest tightened as she glanced at Sarita, whose sharp eyes gleamed with a mix of determination and quiet urgency. "He's a menace, Camilla," Sarita said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the stillness of the room. "This might be one of the rare chances we get to make him answer for what he's done." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and Camilla felt them sink into her bones. Sarita reached out, her hand resting gently on Camilla's arm, a gesture meant to ground her. "Your job isn't about what you feel, it's about justice. Personal history can't cloud that. If the evidence holds up, the jury will see it through. If it doesn't, the defense might walk away with a win. All you have to do is keep the trial fair. That's the line you hold." Camilla let the silence stretch between them, her mind churning. She could feel the pull of doubt tugging at her, the flicker of old memories threatening to rise. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a slow, resolute nod. "I'll see it through," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "As long as I can do my duty without faltering. But if I sense my judgment slipping, even for a moment, I'll step aside." Sarita's lips curved into a faint, approving smile, and Judge Hill, who'd been listening quietly from the corner, offered a small nod of encouragement. "Good," he said simply, his tone carrying the weight of trust. A week later, the trial erupted into life. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, its wooden benches packed tight with a restless crowd, journalists scribbling furiously, community activists whispering among themselves, and onlookers craning their necks for a better view. The air was thick with anticipation, almost suffocating. Officer Harper strode in, his tailored suit crisp and his face carved from stone, a mask of defiance. His attorney trailed behind him, exuding a smug confidence that suggested he'd already mapped out every twist of the prosecution's case and planned to unravel it with ease. Across the room, Prosecutor Adrien Lowe stood tall, his jaw set as he prepared to strike. His opening statement rolled out like thunder, each word deliberate and searing. He laid out the evidence with precision, the grainy cell phone video capturing the brutal encounter, the medical records detailing Malcolm Harris's fractured arm and bruised ribs, and the shaky but resolute testimony of an eyewitness who'd heard Harper spit venomous racial slurs. Adrien painted a vivid, damning portrait of a man cloaked in authority, preying on the powerless and burying his sins beneath a stack of falsified reports. The defense fired back with equal force, their tone dripping with disdain. They argued that Adrienne's story was a cheap fabrication, a melodramatic yarn spun to inflame the jury's emotions. Harper, they insisted, had acted in self-defense, a good officer caught in a dangerous moment. The witness was a liar, the video a blurry mess, and Malcolm Harris a man prone to theatrics. Camilla sat above it all, her face a calm, unreadable mask. She wielded her gavel with quiet authority, ensuring every rule was followed. Every piece of evidence weighed fairly. She silenced inflammatory outbursts with a single sharp glance, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of accusations. The jury a mix of faces reflecting the city's diversity, chosen after hours of heated voir dire watch with rapt attention. Some scribbled notes, their brows furrowing as the video played. Malcolm's cries echoing faintly through the courtroom speakers. Others leaned back, arms crossed, their expressions clouded with doubt. As the days dragged on, the case grew thornier. Adrienne dug deeper, unearthing a trail of old complaints against Harper, whispers of excessive force and biased stops that had never stuck but left a lingering stain. Harper's attorney leapt to his feet, voice rising in protest. But Camilla allowed the evidence in with a measured ruling. "It suggests a pattern," she said coolly, her words slicing through the objection like a blade. The room crackled with tension, every eye darting between her and the officer in the dock. Then came Isaiah Turner, the eyewitness, a weary young man with nervous hands and a voice that trembled but never broke. He stood on the stand, recounting the night he'd watched Harper pin Malcolm to the pavement. "I was right there," he said, his gaze flickering to the jury. He called him a worthless thug, said he was lucky to still be breathing. The defense pounced, dragging up Isaiah's past a petty theft charge from years Agabit. Camilla kept their attack in check, her rulings firm and precise. Each night, she trudged home exhausted, her mind a tangle of images: Harper's cold stare, Malcolm's broken body, the jury's searching faces. She locked away her own tangled history with Harper, a secret shared only with Helena and Judge Hill, both of whom believed in her strength to rise above it. When Harper finally took the stand, the air shifted. He spoke with practiced ease, claiming Malcolm's car had swerved erratically, hinting at intoxication. "He reached for something in the glove box," Harper said, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding Camilla's. "I thought it was a weapon. I had no choice." She felt a flicker of recognition in his discomfort. Did he sense her watching? Knowing more than she let on, she kept her expression blank, her resolve ironclad. Adrienne pounced on cross-examination, his voice sharp as he played the video again. "You twisted his arm long after he was down. Explain that." Harper shifted, sweat beading on his forehead. "He was still fighting me, even pinned. He wouldn't stop." Adrienne's eyes narrowed. "There's no sound of resistance, just him begging you to stop." Harper's jaw tightened, his excuse thin and brittle. "It was chaotic. I did what I had to." The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Camilla stole a glance at the jury. Some recoiled, others wavered. Then Adrienne dropped the hammer, the police report where Harper claimed Malcolm had lunged at him. The video told a different story: no lunge, just a man crumpling under force. Harper floundered, stammering about rushed paperwork and tricky angles. But his words twisted into knots, ensnaring him further. The prosecution rested, leaving the defense scrambling to patch the holes in their case. Camilla held the line, her rulings fair but unyielding, letting the evidence carve its own path. Closing arguments came like a clash of titans. Adrienne faced the jury, his voice ringing with conviction. "This isn't just about one night, it's about an officer who turned his badge into a weapon, targeting the weak and hiding behind lies. The video, the report, the witness, they all screamed the truth. Harper broke his oath, and Malcolm paid in blood." The defense countered with a plea for reason, their tone softer but insistent. "Don't let a shaky video or a biased story trick you. Policing is hard, split-second work. Officer Harper acted to survive." The jury vanished into deliberation, leaving the courthouse steeped in restless quiet. Outside, reporters paced like vultures. Inside, Camilla wrestled with her nerves, her calm facade hiding a racing heart. The evidence was solid, but juries could twist in unexpected ways, especially when a uniform was on trial. Hours bled into days. Then, a note: "We have a verdict. The room filled again. Thick with sweat and anticipation, Harper sat rigid, his face pale, beads of sweat glistening under the harsh lights. The clerk took the slip from the jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steady hands. Camilla's voice cut through the silence. "Have you reached a unanimous decision?" The foreperson nodded. "We have, Your Honor. On aggravated battery, guilty." A murmur rippled through the crowd. On official misconduct, guilty. Harper's mask cracked, fear and fury flashing in his eyes. His attorney's shoulders slumped. Camilla dismissed the jury with a quiet word, her gaze lingering on Harper. There was no victory in her stare, only the somber weight of justice served. Outside, the world exploded, cameras flashing, voices shouting. Adrienne spoke briefly, calling it a win for accountability. Harper's attorney hustled him away, dodging questions. The headlines would scream by morning, "Officer convicted in brutality case." Suspended and facing prison, Harper's life unraveled. His department forced to reckon with its own failures. But the true reckoning came at sentencing, when he stood before Camilla again. As she prepared to speak, his eyes locked onto hers, widening with sudden, dreadful clarity. "Waity know you," he rasped, the realization crashing over him like a wave. She met his gaze, unflinching, a silent testament to the cost of power misused and the unyielding hand of justice. A restless hum rippled through the courtroom, a low chorus of whispers that seemed to vibrate in the air like the buzz of a disturbed hive. Camilla sat at the bench, her posture steady and composed, though beneath the surface, a sharp, electric tremor pulsed in her stomach. She could feel the storm brewing, the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. Officer Glenn Harper, the man in the defendant's chair, was unraveling, his face flushed red, his eyes wild with desperation. He was about to shatter the fragile illusion she'd maintained throughout the trial, to accuse her of bias and rip away the veil of impartiality she'd so carefully woven. Her heart thudded, but her expression remained a mask of calm resolve. Harper's attorney, a weary man with sweat beading on his brow, lunged forward and seized his client's arm, his fingers digging in as if he could physically restrain the outburst. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of urgency, "we request a mistrial. There's a clear conflict of interest here." His words hung in the air, frantic and unsteady, a last-ditch plea to derail the proceedings. Camilla's hands rested on the bench, fingers interlaced with deliberate precision. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself as the room seemed to tilt with anticipation. "The time for such emotion has long passed," she replied, her tone even and measured, cutting through the tension like a blade. "If there were any concerns about a conflict of interest, they should have been brought to light before or during the trial. The jury has deliberated, reviewed the evidence, and delivered a verdict. Your request is untimely and inappropriate." Her words were firm, unyielding, a quiet assertion of authority that silenced the attorney's faltering protest. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of murmurs, a wave of sound that crashed against the walls. Harper, his composure shattered, lurched forward in his seat, his voice a raw snarl. "You tricked me. You've had it in for me from the start." His accusation sliced through the air, dripping with venom and disbelief. Camilla met his gaze without flinching, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to pin him in place. She could feel the heat of his anger, the weight of his realization pressing against her, but she refused to waver. "Officer Harper," she said, her voice steady as stone, "my personal feelings have no bearing on this matter. A jury of your peers, ordinary citizens, like the ones you swore to protect, examine the evidence against you. They found you guilty. That is the foundation of our justice system, not my opinion or yours." Her words carried a quiet power, a reminder that the law was bigger than any one person, even a man like Harper who had once believed himself untouchable. Harper's face twisted, a crimson blaze of fury and humiliation. He opened his mouth to retort, but the bailiff, a broad-shouldered figure with a stern jaw, stepped forward with a clink of handcuffs, his presence a silent command for order. Camilla pressed on, undeterred. "We will now proceed to sentencing, prosecution and defense. You may present your arguments." The prosecution rose first, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice that rang with conviction. She painted a vivid picture of Harper's crime, the brutality of the beating, he'd inflicted on Malcolm Harris, a young man whose only offense had been a broken taillight. The shattered trust of a community that had once looked to Harper for protection. The medical bills piling up alongside Malcolm's pain. This was not a mistake, she argued, her tone fierce. This was an abuse of power, a betrayal of the badge he wore. We ask for a sentence that reflects the gravity of his actions. 5 years in prison, at minimum. The defense, by contrast, was a study in desperation. Harper's attorney adjusted his tie nervously, his voice softer, almost pleading. Officer Harper has served this city for over a decade, he said, gesturing toward his client with a trembling hand. He's responded to countless calls, put his life on the line time and again. Yes, he made a terrible error in judgment, but he's not a monster. We beg the court for leniency, a shorter sentence, probation perhaps, to honor his years of service. Camila listened intently, her mind sifting through every word, every nuance. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve, then at Malcolm Harris, seated in the gallery. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. She could see the faint scars on his face, the lingering shadow of that night when Harper's fists had rained down on him. Her duty was clear, to weigh the jury's verdict, the evidence, and the law's guidelines. After a long pause, she spoke. Officer Glenn Harper, for the crime of aggravated assault and misconduct in office, I sentence you to 3 years in state prison, followed by 2 years of probation. You are also ordered to pay restitution to Malcolm Harris for his medical expenses and suffering. A gasp rippled through the room, in the gallery. Malcolm's shoulders sagged as relief flooded his features, tears spilling silently down his cheeks. Harper, meanwhile, stiffened, his body rigid with shock. The bailiff approached, cuffs gleaming in the harsh courtroom light, and as the metal clicked round Harper's wrists, he twisted around one last time. His eyes met Camilla's, brimming with a volatile mix of hatred and dawning recognition. In that moment, he saw her not just as the judge who'd sentenced him, but as the woman he'd pulled over months ago, the one he'd taunted and detained without cause during a late-night traffic stop. The irony was a bitter pill, and it choked him as he was led away. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with reporters, their cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies. This was no ordinary Casilla police officer facing prison for on-duty misconduct. Was a rare, an explosive story. Word spread like wildfire through the city, igniting fierce debates. Some hailed the verdict as a triumph of accountability, a long overdue reckoning for a system that too often shielded its own. Others decried it as a witch hunt, a politicized attack on law enforcement. But for Camila, sitting alone in her chambers, the noise faded into a distant hum. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the day settling into her bones. Relief mingled with a quiet sorrow. She took no joy in locking anyone away, not even a man like Harper. Yet justice demanded consequences, especially when power was wielded like a weapon against the vulnerable. In the days that followed, Camila found herself reflecting on the case's ripple effects. She wrote a letter to Malcolm, her pen moving carefully across the page as she expressed her regret for his pain, and urged him to seek support if he needed it. She kept it discreet, mindful of her role, but the gesture felt necessary, a small thread of humanity amid the cold machinery of the law. Later, she met with Helena, a friend and internal affairs officer with a no-nonsense demeanor and a quick laugh. Over coffee, Helena revealed that Harper's conviction had unleashed a flood of new complaints against him, whispers of past abuses that might spark wider investigations. The case had cracked open a door, shining a light on the need for reform, better training, stricter oversight, perhaps even a civilian review board. It wasn't a cure, but it was a step forward. Through it all, Camila carried the memory of that traffic stop where Harper's flashlight had blinded her, his voice dripping with arrogance as he demanded her compliance. It had been a fleeting encounter for him, but for her, it had planted a seed, a burning resolve to fight the kind of prejudice and cruelty he embodied. Fate had woven their paths together again, placing her in the judge's seat to deliver his reckoning. She didn't gloat over the twist of karma, didn't let it define her, but in the stillness of her chambers, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced down the ghost of that night and emerged as a guardian of justice, and not just for herself, but for Malcolm, for the city, for anyone who'd ever felt the sting of unchecked power. The story of that day lingered, a testament to the slow, imperfect grind of fairness. It was a reminder that even when prejudice and authority collided, integrity could still carve a path forward. Camilla's journey wasn't over. She would hear more cases, face more challenges, but in this moment, she had proven that justice, though often delayed, could still prevail. And in doing so, she had shown the world, and herself, that the consequences of abusing power could not be escaped forever.